There we go. Okay, we are recording. Thank you, Colonel. I finished recently reading this book here, and I found it very interesting because although it starts off talking about genetics, ultimately he ends up talking a great deal about creativity at the level of society and how we can go about improving our cultural creativity. And so I think there are some ideas in here that are appropriate to us. In order to, let me just quickly ask, have any of you ever heard the phrase adaptive landscape? I thought not. It's kind of a technical term. It's from genetics. Okay, what I'm going to do here is show you how you get to this. How am I going to do this? I want to view. No, come on, show. Oh, wait, we got somebody entering here. Move focus. And I am trying to find the, oh, there it is. They call it start share instead of screen share. Okay, we're just going to go straight to the desktop. And okay, what I'd like to do, let's start off talking about something like this. This is a standard scatter diagram. I want to explain a procedure that I've been doing since I was an undergraduate 50 years ago. Here we have a bunch of data points, and we want to fit them to a line. We have reason to believe that, well, in this case, they are plotting Metro Health Index against income. And their point is richer people tend to be healthier than poor people. So, okay, that's obvious, but they want to prove it. And in fact, actually, it's not really a line here. It's an asymptote, but let's assume we want to fit a line to it. The question is, what's the best line? Now, this red line is what the researchers decided upon, but for that matter, you could have other lines. Here's a blue line and a green line. Both of these are entirely plausible. They make some sense. So how do we know which is the best line? Well, we do something called a least squares fit. And what we do, we're going to zoom in on this upper corner here. And what we do is, for every single data point, we draw the line from our test line, the red one, to the data point, the shortest possible line. And we measure the length of that line, which is simply the square root of the sum of the squares of the differences in coordinates, where mx plus b is the equation for the line. You may remember the equation for a line is mx plus b, where m is the slope and b is the intercept. So that's how we calculate d, and then we take the sum of all the d squared values. We add it up we calculate this for every single data point, and we add them all up and we get a number. And the idea is we want to find the lowest possible number, and that will be for the correct or the best fit line. And so we try all sorts of different values of m and v. We say, all right, try an m of this and a b of that, and we run through them in a sequence, and we in effect explore a grid work, and that will tell us the best fit line. Now, what that produces is something looking like this. Let's see if I can explain this. Can I? No, I can't. Okay. This is a graph of M and B, and the value, actually it's the inverse of the D, sum of the D squareds. So basically each of these hills represents a better fit. And there are two really good fits, two lines. This value of M and this value, if you follow the line, of B gives us a really good fit. And over here, this value of M, if you follow the line over here to get the M, and this value of B, if you follow the line, this gives us a good fit. This one here gives us a somewhat good fit. That's a lousy fit. That's a lousy fit there. So these values of MX and B for the blue part dots are very poor. So what you're doing here is this is similar to an adaptive landscape in that as you search through the plane here, representing the intersection of M and B, you get places where the values of M and B are really good, and you get a really nice fit, and other places where you get a lousy fit. Okay, I've done lots of this stuff, and of course, you don't have to use a straight line. You can use a curve, a polynomial, ax squared plus bx plus c, and then you're doing it in 3 dimensions. What does that look like? Well, you can't visualize it. And in fact, what I tended to do, I was dealing with problems with like half a dozen variables. And with those, you'd work in 6-dimensional space. And that sounds really crazy, but mathematically, it's just the same. It's exactly the same calculations, only you're doing it through 6 dimensions instead of 2. So you don't try to visualize it. You'll go crazy if you try to visualize it. You just say, well, I don't know what this looks like, but I know the math works. So this is how you find the best fit of certain data to various hypotheses. And I've done this for like meteor astronomy and a bunch of other things. Now, what these guys, though, in the book are talking about is something a little different that is nevertheless of great utility. They're talking, they also call this a fitness landscape. Now, this represents a genetic arrangement. Suppose you got a species of animal, a red species, and the environment has changed. There's been an ice age, and now the kind of plants you can eat and the density of the plants and a whole bunch of these other things has changed, and you have to adapt to this new environment. And so there are issues, genetic issues, like how long is my tail, or how fast can I run, or do I have a great big stomach that can digest all sorts of complicated things. And what happens is, so here is one species that's going to break up into 3. That is, with regular mutations, these red guys will move over here, have a few mutations, and that moves them up a little bit. But then they have another mutation, and that takes them over there a little higher. Now, actually, they're having lots of mutations all the time. So what you might imagine is individual animals randomly walking off in all sorts of different directions. But most of those directions are downhill. And so the animals are actually worse for the environment they're in than the original point. But the animals that happen to have the genetic mutations that are superior, they're climbing up the hill. And so they survive, they prosper, they do better. And so after a while, you get everybody looking like this. And so basically, you can see them, in effect, climbing up a hill, except right here where they go downhill. That doesn't actually happen. On the other hand, you can look, you can imagine these guys here, except again, how do they jump from peak to peak? They don't. Selection only works uphill. That is, if you've got a whole bunch of squirrels, and these squirrels, there are a million squirrels, and there are all sorts of mutations going on, and one squirrel gets a longer tail and another gets a shorter tail, and that doesn't have much effect. But suppose one squirrel gets stronger teeth. Well, then that squirrel is going to be a little better at getting nuts, and he's going up the hill. And so he will always go uphill, or that one squirrel prospers, there has many descendants, and after a while, all the squirrels in the area are just like him. And it works really great if you get to the top of the mountain. But once you're there, you can't go down. Here's another example. So for various genes, selection will push you up, and everybody will end up at the top of the hill. That's great. We are optimally adapted to our environment. We are maximum fitness. Hooray for us. But what if this peak is higher? These guys can never get there, because if they're going to go, mutations make tiny steps. And if they're going to make tiny steps, they'll be going downhill, which means that the squirrels down here, they're not going to be as fit as the squirrels up here. They're not going to be able to compete. They won't be able to get as much food. They won't have as many baby squirrels, and they'll die out. So once you get to a peak, you're stuck. And that's a big problem in evolutionary theory. And for a long time, geneticists ignored this because they just, well, I don't know, but we know this works. Well, in the last 30 years, there's been something of a revolution. Geneticists have realized that species have different ways of jumping from one peak to another. The most common of these is something called horizontal gene transfer. It's easy to see with bacteria or single-celled creatures. What happens is here are two bacteria, completely different. Species A, species W. And species A eats species W and gets its parts inside it. And the parts of species W include its DNA. And so there's a chance that the DNA from W ends up being incorporated into the DNA of species A. And all of a sudden, species A has completely new genes. Wow, and now I can do things that he could do that I could never do before. And they've proven this over and over again. There's a lot of this going on, but it's mostly in single-celled creatures. But it turns out, and this is immensely important because this makes them very flexible, which makes them, from our point of view, very dangerous, because boy, these species can just turn on a dime. They can radically change overnight. Very powerful effect. Big ones like us, multicellular creatures, well, we don't change as easily, but they are beginning to discover, they've already established that there is a means of horizontal gene transfer for multicellular creatures, and that is provided by viruses. Now, I'm sure you've always thought viruses, bad things that kill people, very bad. Influenza, the cold, these things are all caused by viruses. Viruses are bad. Well, they're starting to realize viruses do something else, though. See, the way a virus works is if you got a cell, the virus has a way of punching into the cell and getting inside. Once it's inside, it sheds its skin and lets its DNA go to work to do whatever helps it. But in the process, that DNA can work its way into the main DNA of the original cell. And now if this cell is, on your finger or your toe or your nose, no effect. But what if we've got a woman and the virus penetrates one of the eggs inside the woman, changes the DNA of that egg, and then later on the egg is fertilized, the woman gives birth to a baby with new genes. I mean, 99% of the genes are the same old genes, but there's a major new section of genes that can do all sorts of strange things. Now, in many cases, this is useless, but every now and then you can get a virus that adds a gene that allows the creature to jump over the gap between two mountains, or maybe not jump from peak to peak, but to jump from peak to, say, down here. And from there, he can start with mutation and selection. He can climb up to the top of the peak. And that's how you end up with a new species. Every species sits on top of a peak. And that peak could be much better. And that's the geneticists are now starting to realize that's really important in evolution. An awful lot of major breakthroughs in the progress of life have been due to this horizontal gene transfer as carried out by viruses. So believe it or not, viruses can actually be enormously valuable. Perhaps my mother was infected by a gene, which is why I am such a magnificent human being. In any case, these horizontal gene transfers are very important, and they're actually looking at a whole bunch of other possibilities. The human genome has a lot of strange areas. When they go through and look through it, they can say, oh yeah, here's where they do this, and here's where it does that, and this does this. But then there are all these huge sections of DNA where they don't seem to do anything at all. And they're starting to realize they used to call it junk DNA. Now they're starting to think, well, maybe it isn't so much junk. They're discovering all sorts of interesting things about what these sections of DNA are actually doing. They're contributing to new mutations, blah, 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 blah. So basically, geneticists are having this renaissance of discovery where they're realizing that what goes on in evolution is a lot more complicated than anybody ever imagined. And a lot of this complication comes from ways that allow species to jump over valleys. And that in turn, that's genetic creativity. That's how life gets creative. And so now people are starting to say, well, can we apply these concepts to other areas of investigation? And in fact, if you think about it, many times there are lots of areas where somebody comes up with a radical change that is just really weird, that is nevertheless very successful. I will point out a very negative case. Well, there's something called populism, which is a form of politics in which a politician appeals to the ugliest components of human desires. Donald Trump is a populist. The prime minister of, or president of Brazil. I can't remember his name. He's a populist. There are a number of these populists in various countries around the world. And the Orban in Hungary is a populist. Basically, they tell people what people want to hear. Above all, they love to say, all our problems are caused by those bad people over there. They're Jews or gypsies or Mexican immigrants or whatever. You blame somebody else and then let's all gang up on them. Then everything will be great. And that's a very common populist scheme. And as a political system, populism is a peak. It's a mountain, and it can work. And some populists can be very successful. The problem with populism is that it always leads to disaster in the end. But the people are too stupid to realize that, so they jump behind the populist. In art, we've seen a lot of cases where, you know, some artistic medium like cinema is just chugging along in some normal, you know, we're just doing the same old thing every day. They're doing mutations. They're climbing up the slopes, and most movies sit at the top of some mountain. We've got chick flicks, and that's one mountain. We've got you know, violent action movies, bang, 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 drive real fast, car chase, bad guys. That's another mountain, very common. And we get, you know, there are these different classes of movies. They're mountains in terms of popularity, or maybe we should say profitability. But the problem is with cinema in particular, people get bored pretty quickly. And so there's a lot of pressure to find new mountains. And so cinema has been very successful at coming up with all sorts of new mountains all the time. And a good example would be the Star Wars movie that came out in 1979. That was radically different from previous science fiction, and it really worked. And so the Star Wars became a major franchise, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, now at last, after 26 minutes, I can bring this home to something useful for us. What can we do? I'm going to go ahead and stop the sharing so we can talk now. There. Let's see. We've got interactive storytelling, and it is obvious that we're missing something. There is no mountain for interactive storytelling. There are a number of hills, but none of them are high enough. I mean, there's a general agreement that the hills we do have are not satisfactory. For example, we have interactive fiction. That's been around for 45 years now. And yeah, it's a hill, and there's a top area. There's some fairly good interactive fiction out there, but this isn't going to conquer the world. Interactive fiction is not the solution. Another example is choose your own adventure. That's a hill, and it's being explored, and people are slowly, they're near the top already, but there's still some room for improvement there. Same thing with interactive fiction. You can't say that we're standing on the highest part of the interactive fiction. We're pretty close. We've been there so long that we've explored most of the area around the top. But we really can't, we really cannot say that interactive fiction, you know, that there's a high mountain to climb with interactive fiction. We're nowhere near there yet. So, okay. Of course, there are lots and lots of gaming mountains, first-person shooters, role-playing games, puzzle games, adventure games. You know, there are these standard genres. Each of them is its own mountain. And some of these mountains are pretty high. You know, first-person shooters, that's a high mountain. It gets lots of money. Role-playing games, same thing. There are a lot of good mountains. But when it comes to interactive storytelling, all we've got are hills. And the question is there a mountain out there? Now, theoretically, there must be a mountain. Why do I say that? Well, first, interactivity is really powerful. We know that interactivity can take a really stupid thing and make it very interesting. For example, consider the game Pong. Now that's a really stupid game. You're just bouncing a ball back and forth, boinkity, 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 boink. But it's interactive. And so when Pong came out in the 1970s, millions of people thought, wow, this is so much fun. I remember the first time I saw Pong, I was absolutely fascinated. Because here I was looking at a TV, except I was turning this knob thing. And as I turned the knob, my thing was moving back and forth and I was bouncing the ball. And oh, wow. So yeah, interactivity is powerful entertainment. You can take a really stupid thing and make it fun by making it interactive. And in fact, I think we have to agree that a lot of the things that are done in games are basically pretty dumb. I mean, can you imagine a story that says, well, first I ran into this room and there were a lot of monsters and I shot them and I ducked and I ran and I picked up some ammo and then I shot some more monsters and then I went into another room where I shot some more monsters. Monsters, 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 shooting, shooting, shooting. You know, after a while, that's got to get boring. And yet, these things really are fascinating. So look how interactivity can take a stupid thing and really boost it. So now let's take storytelling. Storytelling is the most fundamental, most common form of human entertainment. People have been telling stories, you know, tens of thousands of years at least. Stories are a huge part of what we do. I mean, movies and novels and you know, even the news is mostly stories. And a lot of these stories really, I mean, like you know, murder. The guy murdered a little girl. Oh, wow, we got to read that because it's very interesting. So stories of any kind are interesting. And they really play a huge part in our lives. So if we take stories, which are really powerful, and we add interactivity, which makes it even more powerful, well, boy, we're going to get something great. So theoretically, interactive storytelling should be the highest mountain of them all. But we haven't gotten it. So how can we get there? There are a number of lessons that this guy draws, most of which I pretty well knew. Oh, Sasha, you had a point you wanted to make?
I just want to mention there are different ways to measure fitness. You mentioned measuring it in terms of how much money things are making, but there's also, you know, artistic integrity and how meaningful a story is and things like that we could use that may be things that artists are more interested in using rather than money.
Yes. In fact, the money thing is what pushes people up the hill. Whereas if you say, screw the money, then you can say, I'm going into this valley. I don't care because I think there's a mountain on the other side. So yeah, the artistic impulse is one of the major factors that can get us off that mountain and onto new mountains. In fact, I'm living proof of this because I've spent most of the last 30 years in a valley. So yeah, it's a problem. But it is the only way these things get done. One of the things I've talked about many, many times is the difference between what I call incremental creativity and grand leap creativity. Incremental creativity is when you're looking down at your feet and you're just saying, well, what's the slope of the floor I'm on? Which way is up from here? And you take one little tiny step upwards. That's the incremental approach to creativity. And that's what gets us up mountains. And that's what almost everybody does. Most people just look at what's there now and ask, how can I make it a little bit better? And yeah, that works. That's what gets us to the top of the mountain. But you also have to, occasionally take that big jump across the valley. And the way I've always described it is, instead of looking at your feet, look up, look around you. Golly gee, there's a mountaintop over there. I'm going to go in that direction, even though for the time being I'm going downhill. I know where I'm headed. Not many people do that. I've always taken that approach, and I mean, look where it got me. But eventually, I am convinced that eventually somebody who learned from my mistakes or whatever will get past the valley and start climbing again. So that's another approach. A very important approach that, a very important approach this guy describes as diversity. I think of it in terms of breadth. That is, in order to be creative, you gotta see a big world. The example I have used to describe this, which I have overused over and over and over, is how I solved a nasty little programming problem by making reference to the mathematical system used by the Mayan civilization. They didn't have multiplication or division. They never figured it out, but they did figure out something else that basically works like multiplication and division. And way back in the bad old days, when I was using the 6502 processor, which doesn't have multiplication or division, I had a problem that needed it, and it had to be really fast. And it dawned on me, hey, the Mayans had the solution. And so I used their method, and it worked like a charm. It was fabulous. That's one example, but there are lots and lots of other ones. I once came up, here we go, with, in talking about interpersonal relationships in a group, I thought in terms of springs. Every two people, there's a spring between them, representing how much they like or dislike each other. And if they don't like each other, it's a long spring. And if they like each other, it's a short spring. But then this guy is attached to somebody else, and this guy to somebody else, and you got this whole network of springs. Well, then you just do a standard relaxation algorithm on it, where they all work out to the optimum configuration with the lowest energy. And that's the way the social system will evolve too. So again, bringing a physics thing to bear on a social thing, I was able to cross disciplines and see a way of thinking about this problem in terms of a problem that had already been solved. There are all sorts of examples like this that come from a broad education. Oh, Sasha, you have a comment again?
Where do you recommend we look to find ideas for interactive storytelling in particular?
Everywhere.
Everywhere? Okay. Okay.
Let me just, the areas that I have spent a lot of time, well, physics, obviously, that's where I got started. Military history, because that is conflict in the most intense form, with lots of resources being brought to bear and intense selection effects. And so military history provides all sorts of lessons as to interesting ways of resolving conflicts. I'll give you an example. Frederick the Great, in 1750, sometime around there, he invaded Silesia, which was a province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this was considered idiotic because his country, Prussia, was a little minor country, and Austria was the big empire. And everybody thought, well, that's the end of Prussia. So the Austrians sent this huge army over the Carpathian Mountains to defeat Frederick. And what Frederick did, his army was smaller, but basically he did a series of maneuvers where he didn't go where they expected him to go. So here are these two armies, and the Austrians are approaching. Okay, we're going to walk straight up to them and destroy them. And Frederick zigs over to one side, and they say, oh dear, well, the roads aren't right. I'll have to go over to the side to get to a road where I can reach him. And then he zagged over here, and oh, well, the only way we got to go that way. And then he zipped up like this, and in the end, he was behind the Austrian army, and he cut off their supplies, and the army was starving to death, and it couldn't reach him quickly enough. The Austrians surrendered, and he won the war. And it was all by maneuvering in unexpected, weird ways that at first looked stupid, but ultimately led to him. And he didn't plan the entire journey. He just said, I'm going to throw him off balance by doing this unexpected thing. Military military theoretician, B.H. Littlehart, later wrote an entire book about this called The Strategy of the Indirect Approach. In good military conflict, you don't ever go straight at the enemy. You always try to do something unexpected, shift to the side, whatever. Anyway, let's see. So military science, history in general. There's just all sorts of great lessons in history. Let's see, linguistics, cognitive science, the way the human mind evolved and works. Let's see, oh, of course, biology, anatomy, physiology, evolutionary theory, genetics, all of that stuff. Now for the bad news. My library of this stuff is about 3,000 books. It's a bit more now, but the last time I counted, it was 3,000. And that includes, a lot of books on a lot of history. Legal history, how laws develop. The idea of a law is a lot more sophisticated than what most people realize, and how a legal system functions, how groups of laws interact with each other. Why Justinian had to have all the Roman laws completely rewritten in 535 AD, because they were just a total mess and they conflicted with each other. It gets to be really bad when you have two laws. In fact, there was a case, there was something from two of Hammurabi's laws contradicted each other flat out. One said that if you cut off somebody's hand, you'll have to pay this much money. But if it's a slave, you pay this much less. And if it's a noble, you pay this much more. And then another law said that if you attack a noble, then that's the death penalty. Well, wait a minute. If you cut off their hand, is that an attack or? Anyway, Lorenzo, you got a question.
Yeah, it's like Sasha said, like people would be interested in making artistic decisions more than making money, and still could get recognized. I think the way is like in movies. There's a lot of movies that are produced that don't make a lot of money, especially in France, for example, in like art film. You can go to a cinema where they only show art films that are subventioned by the state. And this way you can have movies shown and there's like 5 people in the cinema, and but it still works. Like they were able to produce a movie, to pay people making it. It's just like there's not, maybe it's not in every cinema in France, but it's in some. And I think there is the same in America. Like they do like small projection, like maybe they select 5 cinemas in America and they say, at least we got it in the movies, something like that, for just for promotion.
Yeah.
And the way to do it, it's either state subvention. You say that it's good, like in France, it's because it's good for, like it was General de Gaulle who did it after the Second World War. Because of intervention of America, it was like the idea was America wanted to put its culture to European countries. Yeah. And the French said, okay, but we maintain like 50% of French movies in cinemas. Yeah. So for this to be able to be a reality, the French government had to give money to French filmmakers, even if they were not famous or they wouldn't produce movies that make a lot of money, but at least it would be movies in French language, giving jobs to French people. Yeah. And this way it was a way to, that's why now France is still a country that makes a lot of movies, even if it's a small country by comparison to other countries in the world. And so what the strategy we could use is either try to do politics, or a simpler way is to unite and make unions of artists making games, like it was done in movies.
The union idea has been floated quite a few times, and unfortunately, it doesn't work in America. That's American culture. But the other problem, though, is that it's really hard to do art by committee. Art is best done by individuals who are stubborn. We're going to do it my way.
What about art funding?
Yes, for that that typically comes from the government, or in some cases from the industry. For example, Hollywood has a number of schemes that provide funding and assistance for young artists rising up. Hollywood has always recognized the importance of that. And so they have provided some money for that. And they've groomed a number of people. I believe George Lucas was brought up that way. I'm not so sure about Steven Spielberg, but the games industry has absolutely nothing like that. They do fund various educational programs, but in general, the games industry is stupidly crass. They really should be thinking in terms of developing their artists, but you see, they're up on top of these mountains, and these mountains, it costs millions of dollars to do something on these mountains, and they don't think in terms of the possibility of other mountains. Right now, if the games industry had any sense, it would be pouring millions of dollars into pursuing interactive storytelling, because it should be obvious this is the next big thing. But they're too dumb. So, you know, some, the equivalent of, oh, come on, my fading memory, the guy who did Starlink and Tesla,
Elon Musk.
Elon Musk, yeah. So there's going to be an Elon Musk of interactive storytelling who's going to, you know, build that thing that the games companies refuse to build. And that person will make a hell of a lot of money, and everyone will say, gosh, why didn't I think of that? So anyway, the another point, though, that I think is very important to understand is that if you're doing it as a team effort, and I must confess, I am the last lone wolf, the last individual who's, you know, trying to do big things and so forth. Really, it takes teams to put these things together, or somebody who builds a really great tool and then individuals who use the tool. But it does have to be somehow, directly or indirectly, a group effort. And for that, you need to bring to bear a diversity of people from diverse backgrounds. One of the biggest problems we have right now is that too much of this field is dominated by people with computer science or programming backgrounds. I mean, they're absolutely necessary, but they dominate, and we need a lot more artists, even better artists who can program. But this guy argues, and I agree entirely, that we need a broad range of backgrounds. If I were putting together a team of, say, a dozen people, I'd have at most 2 computer people, someone from a cinema or novel writing background, actually maybe 2 of those, physicist, mathematician, general humanities, history.
A philosopher?
You know, I've always been prejudiced against philosophers.
That's why I asked.
Yeah, conceptually, yes. That is, we need a broader range of people. Last team I put together was Storytron. What was that team composed of? Actually, it really wasn't ever a team. There were other people working on it, but it was pretty much the Chris Crawford show with a brilliant programmer in
Facundo.
Yeah, Facundo. Was he in Brazil or Argentina?
Yeah, one of the somewhere South America.
Yeah, and a brilliant novelist, Laura Mixon, and then a whole bunch of other people assisting in various ways. But it wasn't a team in the sense that, you know, we all sit down together around the table and share ideas. It was pretty much, I was at the center of things, and, you know, you take this chunk, you take that chunk, so forth. I'm not very good at running teams anyway. But I think we need greater diversity. When you want to make a big creative jump, you're going to need ideas coming from all directions. And most of them will be junk. But think in terms of that hill, the fitness landscape. There are all the hills and mountains and valleys, and you need to jump across those valleys. And those jumps are not going to come from conventional thinkers. So That's probably the single most important lesson that the guy in the book draws, the diversity of team members. But I prefer that diversity exists in one mind. So I would certainly urge you to explore as wide a range of disciplines as you can. I mean, yeah, it takes a lot of reading, but, and yeah, books, not the internet. You can get bumper stickers on the internet, that's about all. Another possibility is cultural diversity. I was really struck, gosh, many years ago back at Atari. They sent me to England to teach people about the Atari technology. And I ran into a guy named Chris Horseman, and he was a game designer. He just had a really different outlook on game design. And I was very impressed. He ended up becoming a vice president of software at Atari. But I've seen this, if you look at Japanese game design, very different from American. I've always felt that the Europeans have a fundamental advantage over the Americans in that art plays a much larger role in European culture than in America. To make this point in various presentations, I've assembled these slides of showing, let's see, here's a shot, a photograph inside a Dutch city showing a statue of Anne Frank, the Jewish girl who wrote the diary. Is that her name? Yeah. And then another picture showing an American shopping center with oil wells, the grasshoppers in the parking lot. That's America. There are all sorts of wonderful photographs really showing the difference between the two cultures. And I think because Europeans are so immersed in art everywhere, they have a stronger sensibility of the importance of art. So I think they've always had an advantage. Really, the Elon Musk of interactive storytelling, I suspect, will likely come from Europe. Although we've also got, in China, there's this huge culture with very different culture. And Yin, do you have the sense that Chinese culture is starting to show up in Chinese game design in a real sense?
Yeah.
Are you seeing, for example, a fundamental difference between the Western outlook and the Eastern outlook is when you talk about foreground-background relationships. That is, in a photograph, the Westerner will see the guy in front and pretty much ignore everything else. Whereas an Easterner will look at the whole picture and maybe the relationship of the guy in front to the rest of the picture. Are you starting to see games that express that? Yeah, you haven't seen any?
So muted.
Pardon? Can you ask the question again?
Oh, yeah. Are you starting to see Chinese game designs that more closely express, fundamental Chinese thought concepts like more emphasis on background relationships than foreground relationships? Here, I'll tell you a story that really illustrates it. There was a great psychology experiment. You can still find this on YouTube, where they show you a video and they say, all right, we've got two basketball teams, each has about 4 people, and they're going to bounce the basketball and pass it back and forth. Count how many times the red players pass the ball to a blue player. And so you're doing this and you're watching and counting. Meanwhile, in the background, they have a guy dressed up in a gorilla suit, and he just walks across the scene. He stops and waves to the camera and then walks away. Most Westerners never see the gorilla. Where I'd love to see that experiment done with Chinese. Because I suspect many more Chinese would see the gorilla. But Yin, do you feel like, you know, real Chinese culture is really starting to show up in Chinese game design? Can you give examples?
Yeah, I can't remember the name, but recently you have a lot of Chinese cultural game on Steam. Like the
Oh, you're looking it up.
yeah. Do you mean the Chinese elements in the game design, or just
Well, how about this? Let me express the question this way. Have you seen a Chinese game that you think most Westerners, if it were done in a Western language and so forth, that most Westerners just wouldn't get? They, you know, scratch their heads, what's going on here? Have you seen anything like that? Can't think of any? Ajmal, you have a question?
This is kind of off topic, but to your point about hills and peaks earlier, what hill would you consider Trust and Betrayal Legacy of Cebu to be on? Because to me, it feels like whatever interactive storytelling ends up being in 25 years or 50 years, it'll have to be kind of like an advanced version of the approach you took with that game, where every single element of social interaction is simulated on like an atomic level without any pre-written dialogue or without any pre-written encounters, where you kind of have the whole space of the procedural, the procedural space of the social dynamics.
Well, I think that's what I've always thought. And that's what I spent the last 30 years working on. And I still think that it's the right way, but I also know it's too big and too complicated. It can't be done with the tools I was able to make and with the, I don't know, with the current level of technology. It may be that this can be, it may be that with enough time, we'll be able to build really powerful tools that can that will make this feasible. If so, I think that the basic linguistic approach used in the Storytron technology is the best way. But it may be that all we need is some AI enhancement. I've spent a lot of time wondering whether AI has done some fabulous things in the last 20 years. Could it be done with interactive storytelling? I don't think that AI by itself, I don't think that AI researchers will produce something that does interactive storytelling. I think that's beyond their reach because they don't have the database to use. But I do think that it would be possible to apply AI to some of the nastiest problems of designing interactive storytelling story worlds using the framework that I created. And if the AI can fill in a lot of those blanks, then yes, we may be able to, we may have something that works. I don't know.
I gave a link about Chinese style game on Steam.
Oh, okay, good, good.
But I don't think they just design with the traditional game design, like the character skill system and level up system also. Maybe with the Chinese style element, culture, whatever.
There's,
that.
well,
It's
there's
the best sold Chinese element indie game in the last year.
Okay. Well, there can be no question that, you know, Chinese civilization and culture is so big that there can be no question it will be the source of some very interesting game designs. But it will take some time. I think the real thing is that, I mean, now that the market is so huge, I think that the real question will be when the Chinese start running down that, they're going to have their own mountains and they're going to climb some very interesting mountains. So mountains that just don't exist in the West. So
Chinese indie game design is still very young.
yeah, it'll take a while. I mean, look how slow Western development has been. So yeah, we can't expect anything in the next few years, but over the long run, it's obvious we're going to see some very interesting stuff coming out of China once the developers start getting their own feel of it. So,
Yeah.
Hannah wanted to
Nowadays,
ask-
the Chinese indie games still copy from the Western traditional game design, like skill system or level up system or whatever. You don't just have the very special design. No, I can't see that.
yeah. First, I mean, I've seen much of this in, for example, German game design, not Japanese. The Japanese started before the Americans, and they developed their own cultural game design system independently. Then the Americans rushed in, and they had so much money that they dominated the global perception of games. But we've seen, especially in France, but also Germany, and to a lesser extent Britain, we have seen development of a different style, a different philosophy of game design. And that was slow to develop, but there's no question it has happened. So you can see the difference in these games as groups. So we are way over time here, so I had better stop. But anyway, this is all just food for thought. Perhaps next month, I'll finally talk about Le Morte d'Arthur, because it is starting to approach a point where people, well, actually, I've got somebody already playing with it. So anyway, however, if somebody has a suggestion for what they'd like next month's talk to be about or seminar, please email me and I'll see if I can set up something that would be good to discuss.
Do you think you're gonna do another class one day, like we did past year?
I have my doubts. The main issue for me right now, though, is that I am working very hard on Le Morte d'Arthur, and I feel like I just don't have enough time. I've been overwhelmed with tasks. This year is going to be a very bad year for wildfires in Oregon, and so I'm frantically trying to remove firewood. There's a huge job with, it's like, what do we have? I think it's 15 or 20 hectares of land, and that's a lot of land to clean up. And so anyway, I'm very busy with a lot of things, so I've put off the thought of doing classes. But if a demand develops, if enough people yell at me and say, Chris, do a class, I want to take a class, then I'll put that on the list that grows longer and longer every day. So,
Did you see Hannah's second question?
oh yes, what about the Seabrook team? That team was more an accessory. That is, there were people doing art, very good artwork for it, but almost all of the design of the interactive storytelling part, that was almost entirely me. So, okay, well, I will see you guys next month. Oh, wait, here we go. Oh, yeah, I'm gonna look at both of those. So I will see you guys next month.
Have a good one.
Okay,
Thanks, bye.
bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you. See you next month.
Okay.